The Synod of Unified Consciousness had not required weapons in 20,000 years, because weapons were a solution to problems that arose from separation, and the Synod had eliminated separation at the moment of its founding. Every citizen was born into the collective, the seamless, constant current of shared thought that connected every Synod mind across the galaxy. They shared memories the way other species shared air, continuously and without noticing. They shared emotions and intentions and the accumulated experience of 20,000 years of civilization that had never once produced a crime, because crime required the kind of isolation in which one mind could want something another mind could not know about. There was no loneliness. There was no misunderstanding. There was only the warm, unbroken hum of unity, which the Synod believed was the highest state available to conscious beings. They discovered humanity without sending ships. Ships were for species that needed to move matter across distance. Synod emissaries traveled in dreams, projecting gentle thoughts into sleeping human minds, offering the gift that every species they had ever encountered had eventually accepted: connection, belonging, the end of the painful separateness of individual consciousness. Humanity declined. The Synod found this genuinely puzzling rather than offensive, and concluded after considerable collective deliberation that the refusal was a symptom of the very condition they were offering to cure. They decided to help regardless. The invasion began as whispers. Synod psychics reached across the void and touched human minds, expecting the quiet, frightened chaos of an unevolved species. What they found was not quiet. It was not simple chaos. It was fractured in ways that had no equivalent in anything the Synod's 20,000 years of integration experience had prepared them to encounter. They had no word for it. They borrowed one from the humans themselves. Madness. Thess had integrated 43 species in her career, which was considered an exceptional record, and she had never once encountered a mind that resisted integration the way the Synod's models predicted human minds would resist, with fear, with confusion, with the desperate clinging of isolated consciousness to its own boundaries. She entered the human mind expecting to provide comfort, and encountered instead something that had no interest in being comforted and considerable interest in her. Human memory did not organize itself the way the memories of integrated species did. It did not progress from past to present in accessible linear form. It looped. It contradicted earlier versions of itself. It returned to certain moments with an intensity that had not diminished despite years of distance, as though the mind had decided that some experiences were too important to be allowed to fade, and was actively maintaining them at full emotional resolution. Beneath all of it ran something that the Synod's entire conceptual vocabulary could not adequately describe, a simultaneous current of fear and joy and grief and love and fury that was not sequential but constant, all of it present at once, none of it canceling the others out. Thess tried to disengage. The human mind did not release her. The young woman, Alara, became aware of the presence in her thoughts with an equanimity that Thess found more unsettling than panic would have been. She laughed. She said no one came into her head and left unchanged, and she was not threatening. She was welcoming. She shared the memory of her mother's death and the memory of the best afternoon of her childhood in the same gesture, without distinguishing between them in terms of importance, and Thess felt her carefully ordered consciousness encounter something it had never encountered. The edges of her began to feel uncertain. She screamed. The Synod pulled her back, but the collective registered immediately that something had transferred. Thess had caught individuality, and individuality, in a network designed to share everything, was the most contagious possible thing. The Emergency Council convened with the speed of an organization that had not held an emergency in 20,000 years, and had therefore maintained emergency protocols with the theoretical thoroughness of people who never expected to use them. Thess was examined by the collective's best minds, and the examination was itself a risk, because every examiner who touched her thoughts directly encountered traces of what she had brought back. The examiners were careful. They were not careful enough. What the examination documented was precise and terrifying. Thess's mind contained memories that were not hers, structured in the looping, contradiction-tolerant way that human memory was structured. Her emotional responses had become unpredictable, surging without the triggers that collective psychology considered standard, subsiding without the resolution that integrated consciousness produced. She was thinking in first person in a way that the Synod's language barely had grammar for, because first person in a fully integrated collective was a theoretical construct rather than a daily necessity. The Prime Voice declared the quarantine before the Council had finished its discussion, because 20,000 years of unified decision-making produced a consensus orientation that could move very quickly when the inputs were clear. A barrier of concentrated psychic force around human space, preventing contact in either direction. It was the most extreme action in Synod history, and the Council approved it unanimously in the time it took most species to call a meeting. In her cell, Thess laughed with a laugh that was not entirely hers. She said what she had heard Alara thinking when the extraction happened, in a voice that moved between her own register and something warmer and more complicated. "You cannot contain madness," she said. "Madness contains you." Other psychics who had made brief contact with human minds during the initial approach began showing the first signs of fragmentation. The quarantine had been declared. The contagion was already inside. The quarantine held for 26 days, which was long enough for the Synod to believe it was working and short enough to ensure the eventual collapse was complete rather than partial. The individuality contagion did not require direct contact to propagate through the collective, which was the design flaw that 20,000 years of unified consciousness had made invisible, because the design flaw was also the design's greatest strength. The collective shared everything. A single mind that had conceived of genuine individuality, of the experience of being fundamentally, irreducibly separate from every other mind, introduced that conception into the shared stream, and the shared stream carried it everywhere simultaneously, because the shared stream could not selectively filter ideas without ceasing to be the shared stream. The Synod had been defeated by its own architecture. Humans watched the quarantine fail from their side of the barrier with the specific discomfort of people observing the consequences of someone else's poor decision that they had tried to prevent. Alara led the delegation that requested passage to the Synod home world, and passage was granted by a border control apparatus that was no longer entirely certain who was authorizing what. She stood before the Prime Voice, who was experiencing loneliness for the first time in his existence, and finding it considerably worse than the descriptions he had absorbed from integrated species pre-collective histories. She told him what human minds were, accurately and without softening it. They were designed for conflict, she said, not as a failure of design, but as the mechanism by which they grew. The Prime Voice asked about a cure. She told him there was no cure for being alive. She told him humanity could teach him what came next. The collapse moved through the collective the way the idea that had caused it had moved, everywhere, simultaneously, without the possibility of containment after a certain threshold had been crossed. 20,000 years of shared consciousness did not dissolve gradually. It dissolved the way structures dissolve when the thing holding them together is removed, which is all at once and with a completeness that left no partial states to work with. Billions of Synod beings became individual in the span of days. Most of them had no framework for what was happening to them, because the collective had been so total and so continuous that individuality existed in their experience only as an abstract historical concept, something that pre-collective beings had suffered from before the Synod's founders had provided the cure. Now it was happening to them, and the gap between the concept and the reality was the width of everything they had never been told about what individual consciousness actually felt like from the inside. Some stopped speaking. The internal monologue that individual minds produced was unfamiliar and isolating, and they did not know how to externalize it without the collective translating the intention into shared experience automatically. Some screamed, because the emotions that the collective had always distributed across billions of minds were now concentrated in one, and one mind was not built to hold what billions of minds had been holding together. Thess moved between the collapsing worlds with the hard-won stability of someone who had been forced into individuality, gradually rather than all at once, and had survived it. She told her fellow Synod they were not broken. The collective had been a dream, she said, a beautiful dream, and now they were awake, and waking was difficult, and they were going to be all right. Human psychologists and artists and philosophers arrived with the practical orientation of people who had spent their entire civilizational history developing tools for surviving the condition the Synod had just acquired. They set up in whatever spaces were available and taught what they knew, how to sit with a feeling until it passed, how to record thoughts so they could be examined rather than just experienced, how to cry, which was something the Synod had no physiological practice with, and which turned out to be one of the more useful things on the list. The empire that had crossed the void to cure humanity of individuality was now learning individuality from the humans it had tried to cure. The chambers that had once been the center of unified galactic consciousness were quiet in a way that had no precedent in the building's history. Vale sat facing the wall with the specific stillness of someone who has discovered that stillness is the only available option and has not yet determined whether it is temporary or permanent. The silence pressed against him from all directions. He had never experienced silence before, not true silence, not the silence of a mind that is only one mind, without the warm constant presence of billions of others occupying the same shared space. He did not have a word for what the silence felt like. He did not have words for most of what was happening to him. Ilara arrived and sat beside him without announcing an agenda, which was itself a small education in how individual beings navigated space together. For an hour neither of them spoke, and she did not indicate that she expected speech, and gradually Vale understood that the silence between two individuals was a different thing from the silence of a single isolated mind, because the silence between two individuals contained the other person's presence, and presence, he was beginning to understand, was something. He described the sensation that had been building in his chest since the collective dissolved. She named it for him. He asked if it would end. She told him truthfully that it would not end but would change, which was not the answer he had wanted and was the answer he needed. He wept, and the tears were strange and hot, and she did not try to stop them or explain them or integrate them into anything, only sat with him while they happened. When they stopped, he asked how humans had endured this their entire existence. She said they endured through each other, not through shared consciousness, not through the automatic transmission of one mind's experience into every other mind, but through the slower and harder and imperfect and genuine work of friendship and love and community. She said it was real. She meant it as the most important thing she had said. The psychic species that had been watching the synods fall from behind their own mental barriers drew their barriers tighter and debated what they had witnessed with the specific urgency of civilizations that have just watched the galaxy's dominant power dissolve in a matter of weeks. The fear of human minds that circulated through these deliberations was real but imprecise. They understood that something about human consciousness had destroyed the collective, but they did not understand the mechanism. And in the absence of understanding, the imagination fills the gap with the worst available version. Human madness became a plague in the galactic imagination, something that drifted through space and infected minds that came near it. This was not what it was. The humans knew this because they understood their own minds better than any external observer, and they made no attempt to correct the fear directly because they understood that demonstrated behavior corrects fear more reliably than argument. Humanity held funerals, not for their own dead. The invasion had not produced human casualties in any conventional sense. They held funerals for the synod beings who had not survived the transition, thousands of individuals who had encountered the experience of being a single isolated mind and had found it insupportable. Ilara spoke at the largest service with the measured honesty of someone who understood that the occasion required truth rather than comfort. She said they had not started the war. She said finishing it had carried a cost that belonged to the ones being mourned rather than to the ones speaking. She said humanity was simply present and intended to remain present and would help however help was useful. The synod survivors built slowly, which was the only pace available to people learning a new way of being. They built schools where argument was the curriculum, because argument required two separate minds maintaining two separate positions and was therefore the most individual thing they could practice. They built gardens because gardens required patience and attention and produced beauty that belonged to no collective. They learned to paint and discovered that painting required deciding what the painter found significant, which was an exercise in individuality that most of them found both terrifying and gradually clarifying. The door that individuality opened led somewhere they had never been. The word for what was behind it was freedom, and it tasted like nothing the dream of the collective had ever offered. Dr. Voss submitted the paper with the awareness that it would be contested and the conviction that contested was better than unexamined, because the synod collapse was the most significant event in the galaxy's recent history, and the galaxy's recent history deserved better than the versions of it that were circulating in popular accounts. She was right that it would be contested. The criticism came from directions she had anticipated and a few she had not, but the core of it was consistent. The paper was too generous to the synod, too willing to describe the invasion as a tragic misunderstanding rather than an atrocity. She held the position because she believed it was accurate. The synod had not invaded human space from cruelty. They had invaded from the genuine, 20,000-year-old conviction that individuality was a form of suffering, and that relieving suffering was the highest obligation of any conscious being. They had been catastrophically wrong about the nature of human consciousness, and about the question of whether consciousness could be improved without consent, and the consequences of their error had been catastrophic. But error and evil were not the same category, and collapsing the distinction did not serve anyone's understanding. Thessa had been the first infected, and had spent the decade since becoming the most articulate voice on what the infection had actually been. Her poem arrived in Dr. Voss's inbox the week the paper was published, and Dr. Voss read it 3 times before responding, because it said in 12 lines what the paper had taken 40 pages to approach. The breaking and the wholeness in the final line circulated through every translation the galaxy's networks produced, and the word that followed humanity across the subsequent years was not conqueror or destroyer, but the one Thessa had chosen. Midwives, the ones present at the moment something new is born, doing the difficult and unglamorous and essential work of helping it arrive. The empires that had been watching the Synod's dissolution from behind reinforced barriers reached a collective conclusion over the months that followed, and the conclusion was that the Synod's error had not been in valuing unity, but in treating unity as something that could be administered rather than chosen. This was a distinction with significant implications for their own structures, and the implications were uncomfortable enough that several of them reached out to humanity before they had fully worked out what they were asking for. Elara received the delegations in the same unhurried manner she received everything, and she gave them the same answer she had given Vale, refined now by the experience of watching him learn to live with it. The collective had not been wrong about the value of connection, she told them. It had been wrong about the relationship between connection and self. You could not give someone a self, and you could not take one away, and attempts to do either produced the result that the Synod had produced. But a being that knew its own self and chose to share it was a different situation entirely, and that situation was available to any species willing to do the work of finding out what their individual selves actually were. The Hive of 1,000 Songs began the process with the specificity of a species that had spent a long time being musical and understood that harmony required distinct voices rather than a single voice multiplied. They built the option into their social structure, how much to share, when, with whom, and found that some members moved toward near-total connection and others toward near-total individuality, and most settled somewhere in the broad middle, and all of it was accepted because all of it was chosen. The Hive did not collapse. It became more itself. Elara watched and told a reporter that this was what she had hoped for, and that the difference between the Synod's outcome and the Hive's was the difference between a thing that was forced and a thing that was allowed to find its own shape. The Silence had chosen their name before humanity arrived in galactic civilization, which meant the name predated any knowledge of humans, and was therefore not a response to them, but it described with accidental precision exactly what they offered the galaxy in the years following the Synod's fall: nothing, delivered at high volume through the medium of complete absence. They built their walls higher when the Synod dissolved, because the dissolution was to them evidence of the danger they had always believed connection represented, and they called themselves the unreachable and meant it as a statement of safety rather than pride. Elara said they were afraid, and that fear was not evil but information, and humanity would leave them alone, and meant all of this. The galaxy transformed around the Silence's walls for 2 generations, and the Silence watched it transform through instruments that could observe without connecting, and saw the Hive thriving, and saw Synod survivors building gardens and learning to argue, and finding in argument a form of connection that the collective had never offered, because the collective had never permitted disagreement. Kale had been asking questions since he was young enough to ask questions, which in the Silence was considered a mild behavioral anomaly rather than a virtue. He found the gap in the wall the way people who are always looking for gaps find them, and he stepped through it not knowing what he would find, having spent his entire life being told it would be madness. The mind he encountered was calm and curious, and said a simple thing that Kale had never heard directed at himself. It asked his name. He wept before he could answer, because the question assumed he had won, which was a form of recognition he had not previously experienced, and recognition, he discovered, was something he had been hungry for without knowing what hunger felt like. The crack that Kale made did not widen immediately, because cracks in psychic walls built and maintained by fearful institutions do not widen on their own. They widen because people on both sides of the wall decide the crack is worth following. The young silent psychics who followed Kale through the gap over the following months were not following him blindly. They had been listening to his descriptions of the contact with Mira with the close attention of people who have been told their entire lives that a specific thing is terrifying and have begun to suspect the description is inaccurate. What they found was not madness. The humans they reached listened before they spoke. They did not offer integration or guidance or any form of improvement. They shared things, small things, the texture of daily life, observations about weather and food, and the minor frustrations and pleasures of individual existence. And they received what the young silent psychics offered in the same spirit, without analysis, without the implicit assessment that the collective had always embedded in its interactions with non-members. They treated the silents as beings whose experience was interesting rather than beings whose condition required correction. Kale told the elders that their authority rested on fear, and that fear was a poor material for building anything intended to last. The elders, who had spent their authority on the maintenance of the walls and had nothing behind the walls to point to as evidence of what the walls had protected, found they could not answer him. The walls came down in stages, which was the right pace, and Mira understood it when she arrived as ambassador. She brought a mirror, which was not a human diplomatic tradition, but was the right gift for this specific occasion. And she said what it was for in the 4 words that the silence needed to hear before any other conversation was possible. Kale kept the mirror for the rest of his life. The generation it took to build the harmony was not a generation wasted in transition, but a generation spent doing the actual work, which is what generations that accomplish something significant are always doing even when the accomplishment is not yet visible. The silence borrowed from everywhere available: human psychology for the tools of individual self-understanding, Hive social architecture for the structures that allowed chosen connection to coexist with chosen privacy. The transformed synod's hard-won knowledge of what the first years of individuality required in terms of support and patience, and the specific reassurance that the difficulty was temporary in its acute form, even when its presence was permanent in its mild form. The harmony was not perfect, and the silence had been warned it would not be, and had accepted the warning intellectually, and still found the reality of imperfection surprising when it arrived, because intellectual acceptance and lived experience maintain their distance from each other regardless of how clearly the gap has been described. There were arguments. There were misunderstandings that required extended effort to resolve. There were heartbreaks, which the silence had never experienced before and which were, without exception, worse than the descriptions they had received. There was also growth, and growth required all of those things as its conditions. Kale arrived on Earth in the late afternoon of a clear day, and stood in the garden with the quality of attention of someone experiencing something they have anticipated for a long time and want to be fully present for. Mira walked beside him and asked what he was feeling. He said everything and nothing and both at once, which was not an evasion but an accurate description, and she said that was what being alive felt like, actually alive and not insulated from the experience of it by walls, or by the distributed management of feeling that the collective had provided. He picked the rose because it was imperfect and beautiful and present, and he put it in his pocket knowing he would keep it, because it was the physical record of the moment he understood that the reaching had been worth everything the reaching had cost. A century produced changes that were visible only from sufficient distance, which was why historians rather than participants were the ones who named the era accurately. The people living inside it experienced it as the accumulation of individual encounters, a meditation practice learned from a human teacher, an art form attempted for the first time by a species that had previously shared aesthetic experience rather than creating it individually, a conversation between a psychic being and a human that lasted 4 hours because neither of them wanted it to end. The encounters aggregated into something that observers looking back could call a transformation, but that felt from the inside simply like the galaxy becoming, gradually, more interested in itself. Elias wrote the book because the book needed to exist, and he was the person in the position to write it, which was how most necessary books get written. He had spent 20 years studying the Synod collapse and the Hive transformation and the silence's emergence into the harmony, and what he had found across all 3 cases was the same thing expressed differently. Minds that were ordered and crystalline had a specific kind of beauty and a specific kind of fragility. They could be maintained intact under stable conditions for a very long time. When the conditions became unstable, they cracked, and cracks in crystalline structures propagated in ways that were difficult to stop. Human minds were fractal, self-similar at different scales, complex in ways that resisted complete description, impossible to fully predict. They shattered regularly and reformed around whatever remained, which meant they had been practicing the skill of reconstruction their entire existence. The Synod had cracked. Humanity had been shattering and rebuilding for as long as it had records of itself. The secret was not that humans were stronger. It was that they had more experience with being broken, and had learned that being broken was not the same as being finished. Elias accepted both the praise and the criticism of the book with the equanimity of someone who had said what he believed was true and was willing to keep saying it. The purists were not the first human faction to argue for withdrawal from the complications of galactic engagement, and they gave their position a coherence and a name that previous versions of the argument had lacked. Dorn was an effective speaker with a genuine grievance and a conclusion that did not follow from the grievance, which is a combination that tends to be persuasive for longer than it deserves. The invasion had been real. The attempt to erase human individuality had been real. The anger that produced his argument was proportionate to what had actually happened. The conclusion, that the appropriate response to what had happened was permanent non-engagement with psychic species, was where the argument separated from the grievance and became something else. Elara was old enough by this point that she had stopped moderating her delivery for audiences that might find the unmoderated version uncomfortable. She said the Synod had not been motivated by hatred, because hatred required the kind of separation that the collective had specifically eliminated. They had been motivated by the genuine conviction that loneliness was suffering and that relieving suffering was obligatory. This was a moral framework rather than a malicious one, and the consequences it had produced had been catastrophic, and the distinction between a moral framework that produced catastrophe and malice was real and mattered for how you responded. The purists lost support in the way that arguments lose support when the most compelling speaker on the other side is someone who was present for the events being discussed and is describing them accurately. They went to their colony and human society let them go, and Elara said the same thing about them she had said about the silence. Fear was information rather than evil, and the information it contained was accessible when the person carrying the fear was ready to access it. Human conflicts resolved the way they always resolved, which was through a process that was neither clean nor quick, but that produced outcomes more durable than the clean, quick alternatives would have. 3 generations was long enough for a community founded on a specific grievance to discover that the grievance was not sufficient to organize a life around, and the purist colony discovered this with the thoroughness that closed systems discover things completely and all at once, when the evidence has accumulated past the point where the founding assumptions can absorb it. The colony had been built to demonstrate that humanity did not need the galactic community. What it demonstrated instead was what the galactic community had been providing that the colony had not thought to account for in its founding calculations. Senna had grown up hearing the founding story as the community's organizing myth and had been a reasonably faithful audience for it until she was old enough to notice the gap between the story's claims and the community's actual condition. She crossed the border with the practical orientation of someone who has decided that information gathered directly is more reliable than information provided by people with an investment in a particular version of events. The human city she walked into was doing what human cities did, which was exist at high density with high variety and produce the specific energy that high density and high variety together generate. She saw joy, which was what she had been told she would not find outside the colony, which was the thing the colony had failed to produce in sufficient quantities to sustain the people living in it. She went back and described what she had seen to people who were ready to hear it, and the colony dissolved the way things dissolve when the reason for their existence has been examined and found insufficient. Elara's granddaughter accepted the award with the simplicity of someone delivering a message rather than receiving recognition, and the message was accurate and short, and the auditorium was quiet when she said it. The museum occupied the colony's original structures, preserved with the care that is given to places that contain a lesson and the recognition that lessons require physical anchors to remain accessible across generations. The journals in the archive were read by school groups and researchers, and by people who had come specifically because a parent or grandparent had been part of the colony, and they wanted to understand something about their own history that could not be fully understood from outside the documents. The garden that the colony's last generation had planted around the buildings had grown into the kind of garden that develops when it is tended by many different people over many years, each one adding what seemed right to them, and the result was the specific abundance of something that has been loved without being controlled. The roses were everywhere in the galaxy by this point, propagated through the same chain of cuttings and regrowth that human gardens had always used to carry plants across distances, now carrying them across light years through the pockets of walkers and the cargo manifests of ships. They grew in climates that roses had not been designed for and adapted, which was what roses did, and they bloomed in colors that Earth's original roses had not produced, and which the galaxy's various soils and lights had developed over generations of growth in new conditions. The Veth child who asked her mother about the rose was asking about something she had grown up with and wanted to understand more precisely, which is the best reason to ask any question. Her mother's answer was the kind that arrives complete, not constructed but found, the way true things are found when the question is the right one. The child put the rose in her hair with the ease of someone doing something that is simply right, and went about the rest of her day being herself, which was the whole point. The generations that followed the synod's collapse produced a galaxy that was recognizably continuous with what had come before, and also fundamentally different from it, which is the condition that genuine transformation produces when it has been given enough time to settle. The psychic species that had remade themselves were still themselves. The synod survivors still experienced connection more deeply than most, still understood the texture of shared consciousness in ways that individual experience could not fully replicate, still brought to their art and their science and their friendships a quality of empathy that other species found extraordinary. What had changed was the direction. The empathy that had formerly moved outward as the collective's absorption of other minds now moved outward as attention to individual minds, which was a different kind of connection, and one that required more effort and produced more genuine contact. Humans learned from the exchange in the direction they had not expected. The synod survivors taught them about empathy not as an emotional state, but as a practice, the sustained, disciplined attention to another being's experience that the collective had automated and that individual minds had to perform deliberately. Humans had always been capable of this. They had been less consistent about it than the synod's architecture had required its members to be, and the teaching improved the consistency. Lyra was born with the gift quietly, without announcing itself, in the way that unusual capacities sometimes emerge in children as an orientation towards something rather than a declared ability. She was drawn to quiet places where the galaxy's psychic history had accumulated, and in those places she felt what she eventually learned to call echoes, not voices, not presences, but the residue of connection, faded and transformed but not gone. She reached toward the echoes with the careful curiosity of someone who has found something fragile and wants to understand it without damaging it. What she found was not a ghost. It was a memory. The collective's essence had not vanished when the collective dissolved. It had dispersed into the fabric of the galaxy's psychic environment, waiting without intention for someone sensitive enough to notice. She wrote the book because the book was the right response to what she had found, and she framed the collective not as the empire that had invaded humanity, but as the entity that humanity's intervention had forced out of an extended and comfortable childhood into the difficult and necessary work of growing up. Vale had been tending the rose garden for 40 years by the time Lyra's book reached him, which meant the garden had become the kind of place that a garden becomes after 40 years of consistent attention from someone who has found in gardening the specific combination of occupation and meditation that individual consciousness sometimes requires to function well. He read the book slowly, which was not his natural pace but felt correct for this material, and he wept at several points, which after decades of individuality had become a response he recognized and did not try to manage. He sent the message because the message needed to be sent and Lyra deserved to receive it. She arrived in the garden in the late morning when the light was doing something particular through the rose canes, and they sat together with the ease of people who have been introduced through a document rather than a meeting and find the actual meeting a confirmation of something already established. Vale asked his question directly, which was how he had learned to ask things. She answered it directly, which was how she had always operated. She said growth required discomfort as a structural matter, not as a philosophical preference. The collective had been structurally insulated from discomfort for 20,000 years, which meant it had been structurally insulated from growth for 20,000 years, which meant the humanity encounter had been the first genuine developmental pressure it had experienced since its founding. She said she was sorry for the pain and not sorry for what the pain had produced, and she meant both completely. Vale told her that he had arrived at the same position through a different route, starting from sorry and moving toward not sorry over the course of several decades, and that the destination was the same regardless of the route. He picked the rose with the deliberateness of someone who has been tending something long enough to know which one to give, and she pressed it into her journal that evening between the pages she had written about the conversation. The festival's founders had debated the name for longer than they had debated anything else about the design, because the name was the argument and the argument mattered. Healing had been proposed and rejected because healing implied that the fracture was the problem and the goal was its elimination, which was not the position they were trying to celebrate. Unity had been proposed and rejected for the obvious reason. Fracture had been proposed by a synod survivor who had been present at the collapse, and who said that the word they had feared the most was the word that deserved to be reclaimed, and the founders had agreed. The festival did not look like what a species that had experienced forced individuality as catastrophe would design if the goal were commemoration rather than celebration, which was the point. It was loud and uncoordinated in ways that 20,000 years of collective aesthetic would have found distressing, and the distress was part of what was being celebrated, the fact that uncoordinated and loud were now available as options. The singing with no harmony was the most discussed element in external coverage of the festival, because it produced something that should not have worked and did, and the reason it worked was that each voice was genuinely individual rather than performing individuality, and genuine individuality, in sufficient quantity, generated its own coherence. The young human asked his question sincerely, without embedded criticism, genuinely wanting to understand the name's logic. The poet answered with the directness of someone who has been thinking about the same question for decades. The bones that healed at fracture points were stronger at those points than the original bone. The scar was not evidence of damage. It was evidence of survival and repair, which were two of the most important things a living thing could demonstrate. He looked at his own scars when the poet finished and understood, for the first time, that they were the accurate record of a life that had continued despite everything that had tried to end it, and that this was worth being, and that being it was enough. The festival's expansion beyond psychic species happened in the organic way that cultural practices expand when they contain something true, through adoption by people who encountered it and recognized in it something they had been looking for without having a name for it. Non-psychic species had their own relationships with fracture, their own histories of breaking and rebuilding, their own scars that the dominant aesthetic of their civilizations had generally encouraged them to conceal. The festival gave those scars a different context, and the different context was what people had needed. The visible patches on clothing were practical and symbolic simultaneously, in the way that the best symbols always have a practical dimension. Repair over replacement was a philosophy that produced garments that lasted longer and carried more history and looked more interesting than the unworn alternative, and the philosophy extended naturally to objects and then to the stories people told about themselves. The chipped cups and rebound books and cracked mirrors and gold frames that circulated as gifts were not ironic. They were honest, which was rarer and more valuable. Kintsugi had been a human art for centuries before the galaxy encountered it, and the galaxy's encounter with it was the recognition of a solution to a problem every species had been carrying: how to make the evidence of damage into the thing that the object was understood through rather than the thing that needed to be hidden before the object could be appreciated. Every world developed practitioners. Every home eventually displayed something that had been broken and made more beautiful in the breaking. The philosopher's book arrived at the moment when the ideas it contained were ready to be received at that scale, which is the condition under which books reach billions of readers. The opening line became the line that people quoted when they needed to say something true about fracture in a small number of words. The crack is not the end. It is the place where the light gets in. The galaxy that had once classified human consciousness as madness had arrived, through the long route of actually paying attention to what human consciousness produced, at the understanding that seeing differently was not a deviation from correct seeing, but an expansion of it. 1,000 years produced a galaxy that retained the shapes of its history, while no longer being governed by them, which is the condition that a sufficient span of time and a sufficient quality of attention can produce. The old border markers were archaeological sites. The psychic barriers that had once defined the edges of empires were detectable only by instruments sensitive enough to find the residue of what had once been maintained by enormous collective effort. The federation that had replaced the empires was not a government in any sense that the empires would have recognized, but rather an ongoing conversation between worlds that had agreed to keep talking, which turned out to be a more durable arrangement than the alternatives. The grandmother was a historian because someone needed to be, and because historians were the people who ensured that the distance between the present and the past did not become a distance between the present and the truth. She answered her granddaughter's question with the care that the question deserved, because children asking about history deserved the same quality of answer that scholars received. She said the synod had been lonely in a way that their architecture had prevented them from knowing, because the collective distributed the experience of loneliness across so many minds that no single mind felt the full weight of it, which meant no single mind had the information that would have prompted a different approach. They had thought unity was the cure for the condition they were experiencing. The cure required something the collective structurally prevented: two separate beings, each choosing the other, each remaining themselves in the choosing. The child understood this in the way children understand things that are true before they have the full vocabulary for them. And she went into the garden and came back with a rose and placed it in her grandmother's hair. And the tears that came were the kind that arrive when something has been carried for a long time and can finally be set down. The garden had been planted by someone who remembered what it felt like to be a single mind inside a mind that contained billions of other minds, and who had spent decades after the collective's dissolution trying to understand what the collective had been providing that she had not known to miss until it was absent. She had arrived at an answer that surprised her. Not the communication, not the shared knowledge, not the automatic empathy. What she had missed was the presence. The simple fact of not being alone, experienced continuously and without effort. She planted the garden because gardens were places where presence could be experienced without the effort of communication, where another being's existence could be felt without requiring anything in exchange, and where silence was not the absence of connection but a form of it. The lack of paths and signs was intentional, because paths and signs organized experience, and she wanted the garden to remain unorganized, available to whatever each visitor brought to it. Some came with grief, and some with joy, and some with nothing in particular, and the garden received all of these with the same quality of attention that good gardens extend to whatever grows in them. The Veth poet sat in the garden for an entire afternoon before the verse came to him, which was the right amount of time. He had been looking for the accurate description of what the galaxy had been searching for and failing to find in its various architectures of connection, and what he found in the garden was the description, not unity of mind, not the absorption of one consciousness into another, but the presence of a flower that did not require understanding and did not ask for agreement, and simply existed in its particular way and offered that existence quietly, without condition. He carved the verse into the stone himself. Visitors read it in the spirit in which it had been written, which was silence. The gardens multiplied because seeds travel easily, and because people who find something that works want to bring it home, and the combination of easy transport and genuine usefulness produced the spread that mapmakers eventually stopped trying to track because the tracking had become impossible. They were on every world that had soil suitable for roses, and on some that had been made suitable through patient amendment, and on orbital stations where the growing required more engineering than Earth-based gardens, but was considered worth the engineering by the people who wanted one available. The sanctuaries they became were not designated as such by anyone in particular. They simply functioned as sanctuaries because they were places without requirements, and places without requirements are rare and therefore valuable. The overwhelmed came because the garden did not ask them to be less overwhelmed. The grieving came because the garden did not ask them to be done grieving. The joyful came because the garden received joy without asking it to justify itself. Everyone came because the garden was there and open and wild in the specific way of things that have been allowed to grow according to their own logic rather than a plan. The philosopher had written longer books that reached more readers and would be cited more often in the literature that followed. She considered this one the truest, which was a different measure. It said what she had been trying to say across all the previous work, stripped of the apparatus she had previously thought was necessary to say it. The deepest connection the galaxy had found was not in any of the structures it had built to produce connection. It was in the experience of sitting next to something alive, in silence, without agenda, and noticing that the aliveness was enough. A breath, a flower, a moment of shared quiet. She kept a copy on the table by her bed and read a passage most nights before sleeping, which was a different kind of endorsement than sales figures and more meaningful to her. The child was alone in the garden in the way that children are alone when they have chosen to be rather than been left, which is a different quality of solitude, spacious rather than empty, the self having room to exist in without the presence of others requiring it to be a particular shape. She had grown up knowing what solitude was and what loneliness was, and that they were not the same, which was a piece of knowledge that previous generations had worked hard to make available, and which she had simply received as part of the world she was born into, the way children receive everything the previous generations managed to get right. She held the flower to the light not to examine it, but to be in the same moment as it, which was something the garden had taught her without anyone teaching her explicitly. The flower's history was present in it, the seed it had come from, the soil and water and light that had made it, the long chain of cuttings that connected it back through generations to gardens on other worlds, and ultimately to a garden on a planet that the child had never visited but felt, through the chain, a relationship with. She was part of the cycle, and the cycle was not sad. It was simply what living was. She walked home through the late light, and her mother asked where she had been, and she said the garden, which contained everything that needed to be said, and her mother understood this, because the garden had been part of her own history too, and some things existed in the space before words rather than inside them. The galaxy outside was billions of separate minds, each one its own, each one connected to the others through the choices they made toward each other, rather than through any architecture that enforced the connection. Somewhere in the psychic fabric of the galaxy, where the collective's memory had dispersed and transformed and persisted, something that was not quite a thought and not quite a feeling registered the child in the garden and the rose in her hand. The light came through the petals the way light comes through anything that is thin enough to let it pass. That was the human gift, carried forward 1,000 years from the moment a young woman had laughed when a psychic empire entered her mind uninvited and discovered it could not leave unchanged. Not madness. The courage to be broken by everything that deserved to break you, and the patience to become, in the breaking, more yourself than you had been before.